The attack had come unexpectedly, and Jocelyn had surprised himself when he had picked up a fallen soldier's blade and stepped up to join the shield wall as it braced against the press of nightmarish creatures pouring out of the woods against them. Jocelyn began to have a horrible realization as he stabbed and hacked and killed the hellish things before him. He realized that some of these creatures were men, others were orcs, and still others seemed to be twisted dwarfs, his cousins to the north. Some of the creatures screamed and vanished into thin air, but now Jocelyn realized that there were other actual creatures of Mantica fighting alongside these creatures of horror. In the shadow of the twilight glade they took on a more devilish form, but they were willing to fight alongside the darkness. The thought of this made Jocelyn sick. He had surprised himself again when he had followed his allies in chasing down the enemy when they had broken through the horrific lines and plunged further into the forest. The evil cackling had returned, a dark, velvety voice that cascaded upon the soldiers as they chased down their foes, driving them to feats of violence that would give an orc pause. Some of the men stopped in horror and fell to their knees, grasping their ears and screaming. Some simply laughed and continued on in their acts of barbarism. Jocelyn found himself repeatedly smashing a rock into the already ruined face of some creature that might once have been called a man, but Jocelyn's work had left it nearly indistinguishable. He retched at the sight of thick, viscerous blood dripping from his hands. He watched as many others around him began to do the same. He felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up to find Aelmund looking down at him. The elf held out a hand and helped the dwarf to his feet, wiping his hand off after he had released his grip. All around him, the soldiers began to come back to themselves, their giddy acts of violence now causing revulsion and terrified whimpers. Eventually they formed up ranks. The darkness was giving them a reprieve, for the moment, while it set up its next acts of horror. Something twisted inside Jocelyn as he thought of how he had lost control, how the feel of the man's head being crushed under the rock in his hands had felt absolutely wondrous. He knew that this revulsion was being experienced by others around him as well. Some were openly weeping, others laughed nervously, their skittering chuckles cackling across the nerves of all those around them. Some still sat on their knees, staring at their handiwork, unable to move. These last were left behind as the army pressed forward into the dark. There was no way to sense the passage of time within the dark boughs of the twisted forest, but eventually they came to a clearing. At its center sat a rippling pool of purple light. It pulsated and whistled like a sucking chest wound, all the while thunder and lightning raged overhead. Jocelyn had no idea how they had come this far, but he removed the crystal from his pocket and instantly lightning struck the ground before him. The crystal grew hot in his hands and he cried out as he tried to cast it away, only to find that it had melted into the palm of his hand, the glowing purple swirls now spreading out like a tattoo across his skin. "What do we need to do?" Aelmund called out over the thunder. Jocelyn had forgotten that he was there. He shook his head as if to say he didn't know, but he knew that wasn't true. He did know. He was just terrified of it. "I need to get inside the rift," he cried in response. Aelmund looked at him a moment as if gauging something, then nodded. He lifted his blade and gave the order to charge.